All right, well, anyway, thank you for inviting me. And so I'm a little bit to introduce myself. I'm a visual artist, and I went to school for painting. Actually, I went to school to a liberal arts university for 4 years, and then I went and got a master's in painting for 2 years, and graduated with my master's in '91, and have been teaching for the last 15 or so years in a variety of different kinds of schools, both art schools and mainline kind of universities. So, so if I'd ever gotten out of the art buildings, I could have met a sociologist, but I never did. So anyway, I titled the talk, "The Accusing Image, the Image Accused." That was given to me, actually. Art is a Patriotic Context Board is kind of my subtitle. And well, I'll just leave that. Remind me if you don't know what's happening on the left, I'll come back to it. So just a couple questions that I kind of like to pose to the audience talking about art. Which is, and I was happy that Ronnie knew exactly what art was, because I still haven't quite figured it out. But as an artist, you kind of always just, hopefully trying to figure out what is art and whether or not what you're doing is art. And so that's the kind of questions I'm asking now. And the image on the left is this a broadsheet engraving that I found online, and it's taken part. This is a text in the broadside, but it's about a prisoner who died in custody in a prison in Philadelphia, which is 6 houses from my house now, in the beginning of the 19th century. And the prison's called Eastern State Penitentiary, and it was a Quaker prison. It was supposed to be the prison design to end all prison design, and very humane and everything. And anyway, this is a little evidence to the contrary. The iron gag of its natural size locked upon Matthias McCumsty, convict from Lancaster County, sentenced to the cells for manslaughter, who died with it in his mouth. Kind of states a different situation there. Here on your left is a painting that I did after a very famous photograph of a lynching in the South in the States, and on the right is a shunga print, I think, from Utamaro, a Japanese artist. And this is a watercolor I did in Istanbul in 2006, and the text reads, as you can read it. And here's an image of a woman named Patriotic, who is part of a civil case in the United States right now of former military, veterans, former military employees of one kind or another, one service or another, who have reported being raped during their service by other soldiers, and then were subsequently discharged. How does the artist bear witness? Is there a role for the non-photographic image in telling the stories of war? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discussion about images today, but I am not a photographer, so my medium is pencils and watercolors and gouaches and prints. And this one reads, "Every night Grainer mistreated us, different positions to give us pain very fast. When we cried, he was happy. This is the music I like. One night they put blankets over the cell, bars. This was the night the prisoner was killed. I was made to stand all night facing the cloth. I am hearing, I thought, a prisoner being forced to drink from a toilet like a drowning. I could not breathe. I thought, my time is near. Then the prisoner's noise stopped," which was testimony that I took, that I listened to as lawyers were taking it from an Iraqi former prisoner of Abu Ghraib prison, who was participating in a civil case in the United States against 2 companies who were military contractors at Abu Ghraib and participated in torture and interrogation. Sorry for the blurriness. Is the photographer's role to capture the truth or a truth, or merely to continue the victimization? And here are two photographs that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. The one on the left is Sabrina Harmon with a man named the Iceman, and he is a prisoner who died in custody in Abu Ghraib and was kept, they didn't exactly know what to do with him, so they kept him on ice for reportedly around 7 days before they removed him from the prison. And she's given a thumbs up sign, and the picture was probably taken by Charles Grainer or one of the other prisoners with Sabrina Harmon's camera. And then the one on the right is a pile of Iraqis, again at the hard side at Abu Ghraib, and you can see them naked with hoods on their heads. And then back here is Charles Grainer, who's the chief soldier for that time period. And if you know the sequence of photographs, this is probably taken by Lindy England, a woman with whom he was having an affair at the hard site, because in the next picture she's in there. Anyway, one of the photographers are not paying attention, they're just jerking off, and on the left is the most infamous of the photographs, or one of them, from Abu Ghraib, and this is a soldier fiddling with his camera on the right, and a man who's standing on a box with a blanket tied over his shoulders, a hood on his head, and who's got electrical wires attached to his hands. And the right is a detail from a painting I'm going to show you in a minute. So every artist starts somewhere. So I had to go back a little because before I got to work with the Iraqis. And this is typical of about 10 years of my paintings, which were not at all about the war in general. I had done, when I was very young, when I was about 23, I came and lived in France for 2 years, and I spent 2 years in Normandy, in the Loire Valley, and in Paris, interviewing older people about their memories of World War II and trying to make paintings of their memories. This was in the 80s, and I was a really bad painter at the time, and I threw all the stuff out. And but I had really interesting stories. I heard really, really incredible things about World War II. And I came back to the United States, and I went to art school. And anyway, along the way, I stopped working on war issues, and I started working on other issues. And so this was just a gouache painting of Mary de Medici's tomb, but I transposed it to Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where I like to live for the summer. And then I'm going to skip all that background about me because it's really not that interesting. And I thought before I get into my own work that I would just show you some artists that, some of whom you know, and many of whom you probably don't know, who are other artists who kind of see their art making as a kind of witnessing. So the first is Jacques Callot, who was 17th century French, and I think was commissioned by the French army to follow the French army around the countryside as they raped and pillaged all over Alsace-Lorraine and different campaigns. And so it's unclear as to whether he saw the work that he was depicting, the things he was depicting, as some kind of atrocity or just some kind of, job. But this became a very, obviously, oft-repeated image. It was picked up by Goya a couple hundred years later, and then picked up by, lots of things. The image was. This is a Goya from the Disasters of War series that was alluded to previously. And obviously Picasso protesting the bombing of Guernica. And then more contemporary American artists who are, not all American artists, but who are dealing with today's wars. This is an artist named Aaron Toole, who was a soldier in the Army, U.S. Army, in the first Gulf War in 1992, and came back, got some training as a potter, and since that war has made 7,000 or so of these mugs, all the same size, and each one he thinks of as a particular soldier. And so they're kind of, he makes all these decals and he puts them on in the firing process, and each one kind of represents each soldier, or the individuality of, he doesn't do research on the soldiers, but the kind of individuality of the kind of things that soldiers would have with them. So you're probably familiar with the book, The Things They Carried. I think that's the name of it. Things They Carried about Vietnam. It's a really incredible book. and the author escapes me right now, but I'm sure you know about it. Anyway, so Aaron Toole makes these incredible pots, and he sends them around, and if they're broken, that's what happens to a soldier. And then he also makes these incredible videos, which you can get online. And in the videos, he puts the pots up in a target range, and he shoots at them. And I think they're kind of incredible. This is a man named Damien Cody who lives in Massachusetts in the States, and he was in the Marines for 5 years before he became a graduate student in printmaking and studied with me. And he was a tower guard in Guantanamo Bay for about 15 months during his service. And as a member of the Marines, they give you this manual, survival manual, in case you get lost from your regiment or wounded in action or something like that. And so the first project he did in graduate school was to remake the manual using all the text from the actual manual and then slipping in his own kind of images. So here on the left is a page from his remake of the manual. It says, preparing edible insects. Hard-shelled insects have parasites. Remove wings and legs. Drop worms into potable water for at least 30 minutes. They will naturally purge themselves, eat raw or cooked. And then here's what he imagined would be like after you've just been bombed and are walking around with trying to get your insects ready. And then on the right, one of his other projects more recently was he didn't understand why you couldn't send postcards home from the war when he was in the war. So he made, I must have made 50 or so postcards like this, and he tried to get them, tried to get the army to send them out to the troops. Didn't work, so that they would have something to send home. But I thought that was interesting. Jennifer Carity is an American artist, a photographer who works with veterans after they've come home from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And she's really interesting. She's really interesting. And she sits down for a period of weeks with the veterans and talks to them and gets to know them over a long period of time, and eventually gets them to tell her about their most recurring nightmare from the war. And then some kind of incident. And then she restages the incident in the veteran's hometown using the veteran and their family and friends as props in the photo. So this is one person's photo that they've recreated, a nightmare of his, but not in Iraq, but kind of reimagined. This guy's great. I think I was, no, I don't. Anyway, this guy's name is Eric Avery. He's a medical doctor. He was on his way in the 60s, in art school, starting out in art school, and his draft number for the Vietnam War came up and it was number 7, which out of 100 meant that he was automatically going to be drafted. So he immediately transferred into a medical program because medical students weren't drafted. And he became a doctor, but he always kind of kept this interest in art. And he's just retired as a professor of infectious diseases at the University of Texas Medical School. And his art always has to do something with his practice as a doctor. So this one is called I think it's called The Fall of Paradise. It's a takeoff, obviously, on Durer's Adam and Eve. But it's all about, this particular image is all about the food industry and the diseases that are carried into the population by the food industry, food factories, and all the different kind of parasites and things that you can get. And it always comes as part of a booklet so that it's kind of informative. Jane Irish is another American artist, and I apologize for that being a bit out of focus. These are enormous paintings, bigger than this wall, and they're mostly, she's been painting these rooms where treaties ending the Vietnam War were signed in Paris, and it's very difficult to see here. In fact, it's difficult to see anywhere. On top of the canvas, before she paints on them, she takes poems from returning Vietnam vets, and she cuts out stencils of matboard and glues the poems onto the surface of the canvas, and then she paints these very opulent rooms which represent the powers that kind of directed the war, and then underneath there's this poetry by the people that actually were there. I think it's interesting. Wafa Bilal is an Iraqi living in the United States. He currently teaches at New York University. And this is a still from some videos that he made in an exhibition called Domestic Tension in Chicago. Both his father and his brother were killed in Iraq in the, I think in 2003, might have been 2004. They were part of collateral damage, whatever that means. And so this particular exhibition, he sat in the gallery for 30 days, and he had one of those paintball, what's it called? Those machines that shoots gun, a gun that shoots paint, hooked up to the internet, and anybody from anywhere in the world could target him and shoot at him 24 hours a day. And he ended the exhibition with post-traumatic stress disorder and lots of bruising and stuff. And it was kind of an interesting, I thought a really thought-provoking exercise, because it kind of is amazing how many people actually shot at him, would just go online and shoot at him and tell their friends about it. Ori Chofshi is the last, I think, I'm going to show you before I get to my own work. Ori Chofshi is an Israeli artist, and this image in particular, because I added this last night because we were talking a little bit about Wayne's work on the Holocaust. Ori Chofshi is an Israeli artist who was born in Israel, but her parents were born in Czechoslovakia. And when Ori came of age and was studying in university, she started to do some research, a little bit of research about the village that her parents came from. Her parents never really told her much about her village, but for some reason they were both able to escape. They were Jewish, so they were able to escape the Holocaust. And she found documentation of this wall of a synagogue in somebody's PhD thesis that had been written in the 80s of Jewish architecture in Eastern Europe or something like that. But it was a photo that was taken in Czechoslovakia in 1946 of this last remaining wall, this one synagogue. The building had been destroyed in bombing, and they took the photograph as a kind of record before they took the wall down and then redeveloped the site. And it turned out that that synagogue was her parents' neighborhood synagogue where they had grown up, and so she uses it as this kind of motif representing all of the war and the effect. Anyway, back to me. Much more interesting than those people. So, I have to start somewhere. So this is my parents' kitchen, breakfast room table. I included a couple things, just kind of putting on my own development of using art as a kind of witness. So this was the table where I grew up, where me and my brothers, my parents had dinner and whatever every night. But it was also the table where I came out to my parents as a gay person in the 80s, and so it was. I did the painting the day after as this kind of site of a moment in my life. So skipping a couple of years here. In the middle of the 90s, there was a murder in Philadelphia of a 15-year-old named Eddie Pollock, and of no consequence whatsoever, I guess, Eddie Pollock, except the story of the murder goes is that there was a student in there were two high schools. They were both in middle-class sections of Philadelphia, and there was a student in one of those high schools who was a young woman, and she was jilted by her boyfriend, who was a student in the other high school, and she came back and she couldn't tell her friends that she'd been blown off, so instead she told her friends that this guy had raped her. And then her friends in her high school decided, that was a Monday morning, her friends had decided that they would, on Friday, get together in their cars and go over to the other neighborhood and find somebody to beat up. So about 21 or 22 students met on a Friday night at around 9:30, guys and girls, and they went with bats, and they drove over to this other neighborhood named Fox Chase, and they pulled into a drive-in McDonald's, and a kid named Eddie Pollock and two friends were just getting off work because they worked there and it was 10 o'clock at night. And so the invading kids chased the three other teenagers down the street. Eddie Pollock unfortunately tripped on the steps of a church named St. Cecilia's, where he had been an altar boy when he was 12, and then the gang proceeded to bat his head against the curb until he was dead, and it blew up in the Philadelphia press, and I didn't really think about it at the time. But a couple weeks later, I was in France doing drawings in Bayeux of the Bayeux Tapestry, which recounts the invasion of England by the Normans. And I thought, oh my God, there's just been this invasion of Fox Chase by people from Abington. So I thought I should do a kind of invasion contemporary history painting. So I did this painting. It took me about 2.5 years, and it's probably this size if you go wall to wall, maybe a little bit smaller. Anyway, it's a gouache on paper painting, and in my mind, it kind of tells the story of this kid who was murdered. It's surrounded by photographers. That's how I found out about the story, kind of as a sit-in stand-in for the media. On the left-hand side, there's a kitchen, the kind of domestic image of a kid before he gets out into the world. And here there's a kid who finally leaves the domestic comforts. This is the church where Eddie Pollock was killed. This is a stand-in for somebody who's killing him. These are World War I issued kind of weapons and bayonets that were attached to rifles. And then this are kind of like images, mostly Western European images of the afterlife, medieval angel from a tapestry in Angers. Anyway, this is it's a bunch of different images. And then this is I didn't know what to do with the rest of the painting, so I just did a big picture of my studio, and here, if you look closely, it's got instructions on how to make a good painting. So, and here's another close-up of the two photographers. The one on the left is the photographer as we think of them as, pillars of our society, and the one on the right is the photographer who's kind of getting off on everybody else's pain, and us too vicariously. Then I very, very briefly, this is another, I started doing these big paintings, so this was another one. This was about two American Olympic skaters, Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan. I don't need to go into it. And then this happened. I skipped a bunch of years there, but I always felt it was very, you have to tread very carefully as an artist if you get into anything too contemporary or too political, because by the time you're finished with the work or the work gets known, the political issue is already over. So I didn't really, as an American who's kind of left-leaning, I didn't ever want to get into the politics of American politics in my work, because I didn't think it was something that would last very long. But I did kind of think when the torture pictures came out from Abu Ghraib that was a moral issue that had longer significance than any particular policy. So on the left, that picture. On the right is, again, this is called the Hard Site. Abu Ghraib is this infamous prison, site of a lot of torture during the Saddam regime, taken over by the Americans right on the front line, right in a suburb of Baghdad. There was bombing at Abu Ghraib all the time, and it's enormous, enormous prison. Thousands of prisoners, but there was this one site in Abu Ghraib called the Hard Site, and these are, we don't know necessarily, they could be American soldiers or they could be military contractors, and these are obviously 3 or 4 Iraqi prisoners who were bundled together. Here's another 2. The one on the left is a man who's tied to his bed. You can see there's no real bed there, with women's underwear on his head, and the one on the right is in a stressed position in his cell. There's the Iceman again on the top left, Sabrina Harmon, and this is Lindy England with the name that man I'm going to talk about a lot later. Just pay attention to these. These are the cells, and these are blankets on the cells. So I saw these images, and I'm an artist in Philadelphia, and I don't really have any power or access to anything other than the internet and the newspapers. So I thought this was something typical of what I was doing at the time. I was very upset about the war, so I was incorporating violent images into my work, but I was hiding it because it seemed like the war in the United States was being hidden anyway. So it was kind of like a commentary on how the war was being perceived and propagated in the United States. So this is a piece of a much larger image I'm going to show you in a second, and these are just images. Basketball players, staircases, hokusai drawings, designs, and then behind it all there's this very kind of unreadable image from a Japanese, 19th century Japanese woodblock of a woman being beheaded by two men. You'll see her in a second. And here's her head, and here's the head being repeated with the swords, and here's one of the guys chopping her head off. And I started incorporating into images like this, images of the 23 or 24 pictures that were public at the time that Seymour Hersh in New Yorker published the Abu Ghraib images. So here's that image of Lindy England and Abdul Wahid on a leash, a man on a leash. And here's another corner with another one of the images of an American soldier sitting on a Iraqi who's kind of wrapped up on a litter. And it's a really bad quality, I apologize, but this is the whole image. Here's Haj Ali on the box, and then this is the entirety of this really horrific Japanese image of these two guys who are beheading this woman. Here's another image from that time. This is also a very large image of people on the beach, but then snuck in, there's Lindy England, and there's Haj Ali, and there's a reference. This is a Cellini, Perseus holding the head of Medusa, and it's a reference to all the beheadings that were happening in 2004. In the war, there were some Italian journalists and Americans that were beheaded and whatever. Anyway, etc. This is another portrait of I think I have some close-ups. Oh yeah, this is Lindy England pregnant with Charles Grainer's baby on her way to trial. There were only two of the prison guards that ever went to trial. Here's again this close-up. Another image from around that time of Lindy England on her way to trial, Lindy England with the guy on the leash. This was some Olympic people. This is the green is a pile of Iraqi bodies in a pyramid and some cranes. And then again, this Japanese woman being beheaded. And I kind of, that took about a year from the time that those pictures came out. And during that year, the Iraqi, what I thought would happen, I mean, I always get it wrong, but I thought, torture, it seemed to me pretty obvious that torture would be considered immediately condemned by the public, and that the government would have to stop doing it or whatever. But obviously it turned around. The American public, I think, still to this day polls over 50% in favor of torture, if it can lead to information. So I thought I would stop there in 2005 and not work on this issue anymore, because those images became political kind of footballs that anybody could use for any purpose to promote or demote any kind of idea. And so I basically run my course with it when I was introduced through a curator to a human rights lawyer who was the only human rights lawyer, a woman named Susan Burke, who has been the only human rights lawyer who's ever filed cases on behalf of the Iraqi prisoners, former Iraqi prisoners, in U.S. courts. And as you can't sue the military for torture because they have military immunity, she created this case where she sued in civil courts two companies, both of which I think have changed their name, Khaki International and L3, I think is the new name of it. Titan, it was called. Big, huge corporations. And one of their small pieces is military contracting, and they had these contracts for interrogators and translators in Abu Ghraib as well as elsewhere. And so she sued them and tried to make a case against them. And still today, if you ask in the States how many people were tortured, people will say, I don't know, 5, 10, 15. But she had documented, and I'll tell you a little bit about the case, but she had over 350 plaintiffs in the bundle of suits, most of which were dismissed by the Supreme Court, one of which was plea bargained recently. But it's been pretty much a disaster in the courts. And Susan Burke, who was a kind of a student of history, knew that the courts and the legal system might be where one kind of justice could come about, but that really, having studied the court action in the Vietnam War, she knew that the court cases could take years and years, and that they might never come to any kind of resolution, and that the victims needed some other kind of justice as well. And so she started to invite artists, poets, documentarians, writers to come along with her on these trips to the Middle East where she was interviewing her clients. And because she thought that those people had a more direct access, that their work was more directly involved with speaking directly to the public. So I met her, and she invited me to come along with her. The first trip was to Oman, and we met 35 or so Iraqi former detainees who came in some vans from Baghdad. They drove up to Oman. We were there for 5 days. I sat in on interviews between the lawyers and their clients in the back of the room, making portraits. And after that, I went on 6 more trips to Istanbul, Turkey. Iran stopped allowing Iraqis to come up. Jordan stopped allowing Iraqis to come in because of the refugee crisis that the Iraqi war produced. And so we had to go to another city. And the easiest place for the Iraqis to get to from Baghdad was to Istanbul. There was a direct flight, and they could get on it. So I went on this first trip. And it was very funny because Susan said, I said, well, what should I do? You know, what am I going to do when I go there? And she said, well, just make art, which was another one of those things like, I have no idea what art is. I've been trying all these years. And she said, she just knew, you know, what you do is art, so it's okay. So I teach in a printmaking department. I thought it was probably time that I started making prints. So I brought us over some copper plates, which is the way you make etchings or dry points. Not to get too complicated, you take a metal plate and you either scratch into it or you etch into it lines, then you smear it with ink and you wipe the ink off the surface of the copper and it only stays where the lines are, and then you print it, and in the printing process everything was reversed. So I brought over 5 or 6 days, I guess, of interviews. I brought over 8 plates, and I did this thing called dry point, which is doesn't involve any etching. It's just scratching into the surface of the plate. And I thought that was safer because the etching, you have to kind of scratch into a ground that you put on, a paint that you put on the plate, and then I have to bring it back to the United States and etch it. And in that time, if the ground got rubbed off, I would lose all my information. So I kind of wanted something more immediate. So I went with dry point, and I sat down. This is the first portrait. And I'm sitting there listening to this interview, and there's a lawyer who's asking this guy questions. And he's telling this horrific story about being arrested in the middle of the night at his home, and hooded immediately and handcuffed and put in the back of a truck and taken to Mosul airport and interrogated, and then being stripped bare and then taken to Abu Ghraib hard side, and then this happened, that happened, and I'm just doing his portrait. And I kind of thought, well, that's really stupid. So I started writing what he was saying into the plate, and that's kind of became my MO. I thought that the writing, what he was saying, was more important than what he looked like. So I started to write his testimony, which ended up being a good idea. I'll just read that one because it's easy. Our eyes were covered with plastic wraps and goggles and moved to SC. We were asked to undress and stayed under the hot sun for hours, cuffed. We were not guilty of anything. If I'd done something, I would have been proud, but we had not done anything. And this was his portrait. This was another man who was walking down the streets of Baghdad, and a bomb went off, and he lost an arm in the bombing, and eventually lost a leg from wounds in the bombing. But when he came to, he had been brought to the hospital in Abu Ghraib because the Americans had simply rounded up all the people in the surrounding area, assuming that somebody had set off the bomb, and so then he was interrogated as soon as he was able to talk. And this is his testimony that he gave to us. To participate in these cases, they all had to have documents from the U.S. military stating that they'd been arrested without any evidence and that they'd been released without any charges. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't really care why they were tortured. They could have been guilty as hell. But as far as the courts are concerned, all of these people have documentation saying that they were never accused of any crimes. I ran out of copper plates and I started doing watercolors because I had some paper. And then I came back to the States and I started making books out of some of the images. So this one, I just want to read this one too because it's an incredibly sad story. When I saw my son dead, I lifted up my son to show them this was my son. An American soldier went to find my son's head He brought my son's head and he put it on my son's corpse 4 feet from me, and they took us to prison. And they took us to prison. So this is this guy, a very religious guy, and he and his wife and his 5 children and his brother and his children and his parents all lived in the same house that the family had had for generations, which is in a farm outside of Baghdad. And one night in the middle of Ramadan, they were all sitting around the dinner table, and the kids took the family keys to go across the street where they had a little shack that they kept sweets and sodas in. So the kids asked for the keys, they gave him the keys, the kids went across the street, and when the kids had left, he heard this bomb go off. So he goes outside and he sees that 2 of his sons, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, were killed, and he picks up one of the sons, and because, as I explained, the bombing goes off and there were American soldiers that came in and they started to arrest all the men in the family. They had him put his son down, they put him face down on the ground, and handcuffed him, and then he realized that his other son had been decapitated in the bombing, and one of the soldiers went over and got the head and put it next to the corpse. And that was what he told us before his 134 days of torture, of imprisonment at Abu Ghraib, which included torture and harsh interrogation. So, because I kind of want to bring back kind of the story of the war as well as the story of the military abuses, all of it, whatever. There's another page from that book. This is a man also from those first set of interviews, two prints. And then as soon as, about 10 days after the set of interviews, when I got back, I got an email, we got an email from the law firm's contacts in Baghdad that there was he's a Sunni, there was a Shiite raid in his neighborhood, 150 people were killed, he was one of them, had nothing to do with our interviews. And so I decided, here he is on the left, and this is Haj Ali, who's supposedly, or probably, or I believe anyway, one of the people that was kept on the box. I kind of thought that the interviews and the notes that I had taken in my prints weren't just for me, which all my art had kind of just been for me up until that point, but it really was the only place that these people, one of the only places these people had of talking directly to the American public. They didn't speak English, they didn't have access to the media, they were kind of pariahs in their own homeland because they'd been tortured and arrested. So I made this installation as a memorial to him, and I kind of blew up his prints and redid them, and at the end of it I made this installation out of these sculptures made out of soap, and the whole thing was called Clean Up America, and the idea was kind of for people to take the soap and wash themselves. Didn't work. This one you've seen. Second trip over, another set of prints. This trip was to Istanbul. This was the first of the trips that I went on where the lawyers then had compiled, there are thousands of pictures from Abu Ghraib, and the lawyers had compiled 2 volumes of about 350 photographs from the hard site in Abu Ghraib, and after, they weren't depositions, but after interviewing their clients, which could take anywhere from 1 hour to 2 days, they then asked after a break if the clients would like to go through the photographs and kind of identify anything that they could to help build the case. And one of these people is going through the book, I think it's here, he's going through this book of photographs after giving this pretty harrowing testimony, and sees a picture of his brother who he hasn't seen since before he was arrested. So he doesn't know if his brother's alive or dead, but he sees this, comes across this photograph of his brother being tortured. It was a pretty difficult moment. This is one of the translators in Istanbul, and here's one of his testimony was unbelievably unbearable. Wasn't even in Abu Ghraib, never got to Abu Ghraib, but tortured elsewhere. And he wanted me to make a portrait of him to take home for his family. That was nice. Here's these are some of the Iraqis. Here, translator, Susan Burke is a human rights lawyer. She was one of the note takers. Then there were people from Doctors Without Borders that were with us. He was a New Yorker living in Istanbul who kind of arranged things. Rory Kennedy is a filmmaker, and daughter Bobby Kennedy came with us. Then when another kind of moment, there was one of the people that I wasn't able to talk to or sit under an interview was a woman. The women, there weren't many women that came forward, and there were even fewer that would let me into the room when they were talking to the lawyers. primarily because I didn't want to talk about being raped in front of a man. So anyway, I met this one woman, and then about a year and a half later, we got an email again. This was 2006, 2007. She'd been kidnapped, she'd been raped and mutilated. It was a Shiite on Sunni thing again. And her body showed up in the morgue about 3 months later. And so I decided to do a memorial to her, and I took her testimony. I asked her family if I could have the testimony she did give to the lawyers. They agreed. I took her testimony, and I stamped it on the floor of this gallery, so that these are the two emails from Baghdad saying she's missing, saying she was found in the morgue. And this is her testimony. And this is testimony of one other woman. It's another thing I won't go into, but in order to go into the exhibition, you had to kind of defile her testimony. Or I wanted to make, not defile, but I wanted Americans, back in the United States who, after all, agreed to the war one way or the other, have some kind of physical connection to what was going on. So in order to go in and have this wonderful art experience, they would have to go in and deal with Matid's testimony. So this is the great icon, or one of them. And I thought I'd read you just, I don't know, am I going? Yeah, you're still with me, right? I thought I'd read you some passages from this book, The Ticking of Zaman, by Nick Flynn, who was a poet that came with us. And so this man here, he gave us this testimony looking at that picture. And I'm just going to read a couple pages. Kind of just, it's interesting. By the time I land in Istanbul, I'm so jet-lagged, so bone-tired, that in the taxi to the hotel, I'm almost hallucinating. We pass men in their underwear swimming in the Bosphorus. We pass fields of weekend picnickers sprawled out on ornate fabrics in the sun. Traffic sounds, a mizrine, a pop song on the radio, everything is calling us to prayer. The taxi drops me off at the Armada Hotel. I check in and ask where the lawyers are, and within a few minutes, I knock on the door to room 223. After brief introductions, I find myself sitting next to a man telling the story of how he ended up in a photograph I've seen many times by now, a photograph the whole world has seen. A photograph is like a house. Once it is made, we then start counting the days and then the years from when it was made. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the light. Tell me what happened next, the lawyer whispers. The room turns out to be utterly mundane, well lit, carpeted, a hotel room that one can find in any major city. The bed has been removed, and in its place is a table. The lawyer sits at the table across from the ex-detainee. Another lawyer sits next to her, typing out the transcript of the conversation on a laptop. The translator sits at the head of the table between the lawyer asking the questions and the ex-detainee. There is also an artist present, seated away from the table near the window, painting a watercolor portrait in a large book, its pages folded like an accordion. When he isn't painting the portrait, he fills in the white space around the painted head with bits of what is being said. The seat next to the ex-detainee is empty, and this is where I sit, my notebook open. It is likely you have seen the photograph of the naked man being dragged by a leash out of a cell by a girl named England. Let's call him Amir. This is the third time the lawyers have met with Amir. The first time was in Amman, Jordan, where he told about his years at Abu Ghraib. The second time was 6 months ago in Istanbul, when a team of doctors examined him to corroborate his scars. This time is for him to look through the binder of now infamous photographs to identify who and what he can. A painting on the wall behind his head depicts a scene from Turkey's past, peacocks and lions mingling together in a sultan's garden, a dark-skinned slave tending over it all. Amir was a businessman awaiting shipment of air conditioners from Iran when the CIA broke into his hotel room and arrested him. He was in his late 20s then. When we get to the photograph of him being dragged by the leash, he stops. I remember that night, he says. I remember everything. And then he tells us the story. The lawyer never takes her eyes off his face as he speaks, softly repeating, and then what happened? And then what? And he tells of his body being dragged from room to room, cell to cell. It is only a year since Amir was released from prison. The soldiers called the day of his release the Happy Bus Day. Tomorrow you will get to ride on the Happy Bus, they told him. Today, a year later, Amir shakes his head as he looks at the photographs of himself from that time. I cannot recognize myself as that man, he says. Can you? There is a moment in Amir's story, as there will be in every story, when words are not enough. A moment when the only way to tell us what has happened is to show us what they did to his body. At this moment, he pushes back from the table and stands. They hang me this way, he says, and raises his arms out to his side as if crucified in the air. Something about him standing, about his body suddenly rising up, completely unhinges me. Something about it makes his words real in a way they hadn't been before. At this moment, I get it. These words are about his body. It was his body this story happened to, the body that is right here beside me in this room. I could barely even imagine just yesterday his body that is now filling the air above our heads, our eyes upturned to see him. Amir stands there like that, his arms outstretched. The scribe has nothing to write, the painter has nothing to paint, the interpreter has nothing to interpret. The lawyer's eyes are fixed on his eyes. All his words have led us to this one moment when his body is finally allowed to speak. The lawyer shakes her head slightly. And what happened next, she says softly, and he lowers his arms and sits. At times in the silence when a question is asked and when the translator translates it, and when the answer is given, the only sound is the clink, clink, clink of the artist cleaning his brush in a glass of water. After 4 hours, we finish going over the photographs with Amir, and we are all completely drained. As we stand to thank him, he reaches into his bag and takes out a camera. It looks so odd in his hands. He asks the translator to ask us to stand against one wall, and he gestures toward it. We all move awkwardly to one corner of the room, gather together in front of a painting of a hammam. Amir raises the camera to his eyes and smiles. You see, it's not only the Americans who like to take photographs. I love that. Okay, last one. 2007. In Istanbul, while collecting testimonies, we asked each ex-detainee to describe the room where his torture took place. Each man looked around him. It looked like this room, each responded. There was a table, there was a computer, someone was always behind me. What did the person who tortured you look like? Was the next question, and the detainee would look at me, and then look at the artist, the only two white men in the room, and either point to him or point to me. He looked like him, was the answer. So that's kind of, I love that book, but that was from this set of interviews that Nick came with us. And on this particular trip, I decided to keep all of the testimony in one book, so I brought over an accordion-style book, and I painted each day's portraits in the book. And it unfolds to about 34 feet. These are two more portraits. This one was amazing. I don't want to bore you, but this guy came in. This is about 6 feet across, and the lawyers. I don't get to read anything about these people before they start. I don't have privilege to lawyers' documents. So, but one of the lawyers said to me, you know, he's got a terrible story to tell. It's gonna take all morning, probably this afternoon, maybe tomorrow. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna leave a lot of space for this guy, and I opened up the whole book, you know, to 6 pages, and to 6 feet. And I started doing an underpainting, which is how I kind of started building up the painting. And then as he started talking, I started to write down his testimony. And he starts to tell the story about the interrogators would come to his cell, and they would beat him up in the cell until he was unconscious. And then he would wake up in the interrogation room, and they would essentially interrogate him until he was unconscious again. And then he would wake up in the cell, and this went on for days and days. Anyway, he starts to tell that story, and he breaks down in tears. He leaves the room, and we don't see him for 4 or 5 hours. Just takes off into Istanbul someplace. And at that point, when he came back later that day, and he agreed to sit and talk to us, I decided that I was going to leave that page empty because he needed that space to collect his thoughts. He needed. Part of the thing with these images is I don't want them to be easy to read because it isn't easy to go through what they're telling us. So I want them to kind of, it's kind of like the walking on the floor, you know, you should pay, somehow there should be participation. So anyway, he comes back and he tells us this really horrible story. He was kept for 6 months attached to a prison cell all day long, like 8 hours a day, like this, naked, and they would throw cold water on him, and there was no heat, and it was winter, and dogs would bark, and bad. Not good. So I took the testimony from that story, from that book, from each person's testimony, and asked one of the translators to write it out in Arabic, to retranslate and write it out in Arabic, language I don't understand and I don't have any access to. And then I turned that into 100 slide stills, and I projected it onto the floor of a next exhibition. And then as you walk through the exhibition, the words could print on you, and if you knew anything about it, if you knew how to read it, they meant something, and if you didn't, they didn't. This is a book I have here called Redacted, so I'm going to show that to you in a minute. This was a whole another project, was the Nicer Square Massacre, which the Blackwater companies, the military contracting companies, changed its name to ZXE. I think it's XEE even. And it's this really horrible story. Not torture in prison, but want to hear the story? I'm going to go on. These are just kind of more from that. It was another kind of piece of the war. These aren't people that were in prison, they were just collateral damage on the side of the road. The one person who watched his brother being shot. This is kind of work I've been doing since, kind of like trying to come up with some kind of summary for what it's like to see the war. I was actually at a conference with a photographer for the New York Times who'd been embedded in Iraq for 6 years, and he had taken hundreds of photographs of American soldiers being wounded and killed in the war, and only one was ever published, and that's because they were all censored. And all of the photographs of American, British, whatever, war dead was censored, at least coming into the United States. And he said that the American public's blinded because the photographers have all been blinded. And I kind of thought about a blinded photographer and what that would mean, and created this image. Here's a blinded photographer with the caskets behind him, and soldiers to and from the war. This is a paper version on display at a museum. This is just another project of ex-prisoners in Philadelphia. There's an unbelievably high incidence of imprisonment of young black men, and so I started working with not so young black men who had been in prison in their teens, and they would tell me their stories, how they got arrested and what it was like, and how they got out. Then I started working with veterans. This one was a homeless veteran, and so I started making constructions of shelters for veterans. And the latest of these projects, anyway, was military sexual assault victims, and this is this ongoing case. It's getting a lot of traction in the United States right now, but the incidence of reported rape in the military in the U.S. is 3,000 plus per year, and they think that's probably 1 in 10 that are reported, and of those 3,000, under 5% of the perpetrators of the rape are ever charged, let alone prosecuted. But over 85% of the people that report being raped within a year are discharged from the military. And so most of the plaintiffs in this case want to get back into the military, which is amazing. But anyway, these are some of the women I interviewed. And some of the men, also part of the case. And this guy's daughter committed suicide after being raped in the case. And this is one who didn't want me to tell any of her story, but I thought it was kind of a powerful image. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I did bring a